Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our BrainHQ Academy webinar. Today's topic is humor in the brain. The true funny bone is in your head. My name is Margie. I'll be your co-host today. And we will have quite a full agenda. We'll start with our CEO here at Posit Science, Henry Mahncke, will give a 20-minute presentation on the topic. Henry is not just our CEO, he's also a neuroscientist. He earned his PhD in neuroscience at the University of California at San Francisco, where he studied brain plasticity. And he's been our CEO here for about 10 years now, maybe a little more. After that 20-minute presentation, Henry will be joined in discussion with a guest, a very special guest. Her name is Karen Twelves, and she is a comedian. She is an improv teacher, actually. She's been an improv coach since 2012 and has been performing in the Bay Area since 2008. A few years ago, she published Improv for Gamers, an exercise book highlighting how tabletop role players and players of live action games can harness the same skills used by improv performers. After that, we'll have a live audience Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question at any time, just scroll down to the bottom of your screen and hit that Q&A button. You can type your question in there. We will try to answer as many as we can at the end of this presentation. We probably won't get to all of your questions, but we'll do our very best. The webinar is being recorded. You can find all of our recordings on youtube.com/brainhq. You can subscribe to that channel and you'll see it when it comes out. That'll probably be next week. We'll also be sending an email to everyone who registered for this webinar with that link, so that if you want to watch it again or share it with friends, you can do so. Now I would like to introduce you to Karen. We're going to start with a little activity. Everyone can participate. We're going to participate live, but if you want to write your answers, feel free to do so in the chat. So with that, I will hand it over to Karen.
Hello all. We're going to play a little warm-up game. It's one of my favorites for any occasion, for improv, but also it's really good with kids in a long car ride. I actually used to use this game also to practice vocabulary when I taught English as a second language. So the way it's going to work is I'm going to ask Margie to name any three things in a category, and she's going to try to name them as fast as possible. So, hey, Margie, what are three things that are very tall?
Giraffes, skyscrapers, and Andre the Giant.
Fantastic. So Margie did the thing. So we're all going to celebrate that. And I encourage you to do this at home by pumping your fists and shouting, three things. Can we all try that on the count of three? I'm just going to trust that y'all will do it. 1, 2, 3. Three things. Fantastic. And if you want to type in your own answers in the chat, kind of as we're playing from category to category, that would be fun too. So Margie, why don't you pass it to somebody else now and ask a new category?
Great. So Stephanie, what are three things you find in a car?
Three things that I find in a car: my phone charger, my manual for my car, and a garbage bag.
Three things.
Henry, can you name three kinds of flowers?
Three kinds of flowers. Well, tulips, which I grew when I was a kid, and roses, of course, are appropriate really for every occasion. And third kind of flower, the flowering of the human spirit that we all enjoy when we learn something.
Three things.
And Karen, why don't you name three cool kinds of hats?
Three cool kinds of hats. Well, there's red hats, there's warm hats, and there's very tall hats. Three things.
Tall hats are among my favorite.
Yeah. And that is three things. And now, if you played along, you are officially an improviser. Congratulations. You don't need a certificate.
No.
All right. Next, we're going to go to a poll, right, Stephanie?
That is correct. So let me go ahead and get that poll queued up here. Hang on just a sec, folks. All right, so our first poll for today is, how many times per day do you think you laugh? You should see a little poll box pop up on screen there. Go ahead and submit your answer. Maybe you think you don't laugh all that much, maybe less than 5 times a day. Maybe you're doing it a little bit more frequently, 5 to 15 times a day. Doing it more often than that, 15 to 25 times a day. You're doing a lot of laughing, 25 to 50 times a day. Or maybe you are the most humorous person ever, find humor in everything, and you're laughing all the time, and you're laughing more than 50 times a day. Let us know in that poll.
Those people with 50 times a day or more, I want to hang out with them. That's
Yeah,
not fun.
exactly.
I was talking to my wife and she said, everything we're watching on TV right now is quite sad. We need to find some more sitcoms to watch. So maybe that would help us laugh some more.
Yeah,
Agreed.
absolutely. Got to break up the serious dramas with the funny
Right.
comedies.
Mhm.
All right, so answers are still coming in. Got about 75% of all the participants hopping in on that poll. Henry, how often do you think you laugh a day?
I was looking at this and I think probably 5 to 15. I find a lot of things funny, but I don't necessarily laugh, although we'll talk about why that might be during the talk. How about you?
I live with a bunch of very hilarious people, so I tend to think at least 25 to 50, if not more than 50 on a regular basis.
You
I
are
think it
living-
also depends on how you define laughing. Sometimes I'll look at a funny image and, blow a little more blow a little more air out of my nose. I don't know if that counts as a laugh or not.
I think it does. I think it does.
Yeah, so probably more than 50 then. Karen, how about you?
Oh, yeah, I thought about that too. Are we talking about like a big belly laugh or kind of an explosive vocal laugh? Because I think definitely I spend a lot of time on TikTok and I do a lot of like, as you watch it. But like, is that a full laugh? It's
I'm going
hard
to give you
say.
full credit for a chuckle, Karen. Even the
Okay.
slightest chuckle, we're going to give you credit for.
Then perhaps around 25 times a day.
Right.
And then Margie, what do you think for you?
I don't know. I'm going to go with 15 to 25 times per day. But having seen this, I'm going to shoot for more.
It's a good plan. All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up the poll here. We've got about 81% of people who have participated in that, so that's a pretty good sample size, I think. So it looks like about a third of folks say that they don't laugh all that much, less than 5 times a day, but almost half of you say that you laugh, somewhere between 5 and 15 times a day. So it's a little surprising to me.
I was thinking about the 0 to 5 when I first got there and then thought, well, you know what, I do a lot
Counts
of
as a
little
laugh.
laughs.
Yeah.
But like
exactly.
big out loud belly laughs, yeah, maybe not as many times a day as I would like.
For
Yeah, I
sure.
think I'd agree with that. All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning into the poll. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing there. And
I will say there's kind of a public lore that little kids laugh something like 300 times a day, and that adults laugh more like 17 times a day. I don't know that that's actually an accurate statistic, but that's kind of what I've been reading.
Yeah, I think it comes back to how you're defining what a laughter is or what laughing is. So it's going to vary from person to person and situation to situation. All right, so that's going to wrap it up for the poll. Henry, do you want to go ahead and get started with your presentation?
Yeah, let's see if I can make this technology work. Okay, fantastic. Well, let's just dive in though. So, hey, that was a fun way to start the webinar. My brain's feeling all stretched out and creative now. So thank you, Karen. And that's the perfect prep for a webinar that's about humor in the brain, because having a sense of humor, appreciating what makes something funny, and being the kind of person who can make other people laugh requires a lot of creativity and a lot of brain functions. So let's talk today about humor in the brain. What makes something funny? What happens in the brain when we find something funny? And what happens in that rare situation where we ourselves are fun and funny? So let's dive into all that in today's Brain Health Academy webinar. So let me start off by, again, moving a few windows around here. Here we go. Let's start with a little problem. As E.B. White, who is the author of the classic book Charlotte's Web, says here, humor can be dissected just like a frog can, but the thing dies in the process and the innards are discouraging to any but the most purely scientific mind. So despite his warning, we're going to dissect humor a little bit today, as scientists are wont to do. I don't know if it will be funny to go through a dissection of humor, but I hope it'll be interesting and maybe we'll have some fun along the way. Let's see what we can learn. So let's start off with some ideas around what makes something funny. Well, it turns out that psychologists and other people have been studying this for thousands of years. And in fact, the issue of what's funny was originally tackled by philosophers in ancient Greece. Aristotle and Plato both discussed comedy. And in fact, Aristotle mentions in his writings on poetry that he's going to write an entire book about comedy. But if he ever did, it's been lost to us. But what we know from both of those philosophers is that at that time, they generally saw comedy what was funny, as a sense of superiority over someone less fortunate from yourself. Basically, they laughed when bad things happened to other people. And here's a good example of that from a more modern comedian, Mel Brooks. Mel Brooks said, "Tragedy is when I cut my finger. Comedy is when you fall into an open sewer and die." So, it's sad if it happens to me, but it's funny it happens to you. But that can't be the whole story. That's maybe a somewhat primitive notion of comedy, and it certainly doesn't explain wordplay or puns or other kinds of humor like that. So Sigmund Freud actually came up with the next idea about humor. He believed that tension built up in our minds because everyday life is stressful and interacting with other people was stressful, and humor was a way to get relief from that stress. So here's a joke that loosely illustrates that idea. I had an IQ test. The results came back negative. So, in the first part of this joke, it creates some stress. Hey, does this person think he's smarter than everyone else? Is that why he's talking about his IQ? And the second part relieves that stress. Okay, good news. He's just making fun of himself. But that still doesn't cover every kind of humor. And so the next idea came up in the 20th century. And this was really the idea of incongruity. The idea here is that we find something funny if it's incongruous, if it's a surprise that it happened. So here's a joke that gets at this idea. I have an EpiPen. My friend gave it to me as he was dying. It seemed very important to him that I have it. So a lot of people might find that a funny joke, right? It's a surprise. It's incongruous that the person that's telling the story doesn't realize that he's supposed to save his friend's life with the EpiPen. But even incongruity doesn't really explain all of humor. Like lots of things are incongruous, but they aren't funny. If I walk home and I see that my house has been broken into and my TV's been stolen, that's incongruous. That's a surprise, but I'm certainly not going to find that funny. So these days, most psychologists have what they call benign violation theory, which is kind of a complicated way to say, hey, it's funny if at first it's a violation, something surprising or unexpected happened. But it has to be benign. It has to be not too bad. There's kind of a sweet spot between being surprising, but not being too scary or horrible. Now, everyone's sweet spot's a little bit different, which is why different people find different things funny. So here's an example from Jerry Seinfeld talking about a TV commercial for laundry detergent. He says, look, now they show you that detergents take out blood stains. That's a pretty violent image. I think if you got a t-shirt with a blood stain all over it, maybe laundry isn't your biggest problem. Maybe you should get rid of the body before you do the wash. Now, that joke's a violation, right? Getting rid of a body is pretty clearly against the rules, no matter what state you live in. But it's benign because he's talking about laundry. Laundry is something that we do every week, week in and way out. It's an ordinary part of our ordinary life. And so that's how most psychologists right now think about what makes something funny. But why do we actually laugh when something funny happens, right? What's the difference between some of those people getting 0 to 5 laughs per day and some of those people getting 50 laughs per day? Well, there seem to be 3 main reasons why people laugh. The first is that laughing is social. It turns out that people are about 30 times more likely to laugh in a group than they're by themselves. And probably a lot of us have had that experience, right? Even if we're watching something funny on TV, if we're watching it by ourselves, we might smile. But if we're watching it with a friend or a spouse or kids or what have you, we're much more likely to laugh out loud. And that's because it conveys social information. And in fact, I think a lot of people who are maybe not laughing as much, it's because maybe they are by themselves a little bit more. They're still finding things funny, but they don't share that with laughter with people who might be around them. A second thing about why we laugh is that laughing is a way to communicate. It turns out in a group, the person talking is actually the most likely to laugh. And you might think, well, that's because maybe they think they're funny and no one else does. But it turns out that people who study this kind of laughter find that laughing is a way for someone who's speaking to indicate that something's not so serious, or to indicate that they're trying to build relationships among people they're working with or telling stories to, or indicate to other people that they think something's funny and you might also. So it's a way of communicating in a conversation. And finally, laughing builds group identity. Everyone who's laughing shares an understanding of the world, right? We all see the same funny thing, we get the joke and we laugh together, and that builds those kinds of community bonds. Now, of course, that last one can be a problem sometimes too. Laughter can build up group identity, but it can also make people feel excluded sometimes. Everyone's laughing at the joke except for me, and I didn't get it, so now I feel excluded from the group. So humor can be a double-edged sword there, and it's important to be thoughtful about who you're laughing with. So we humans like to laugh, but are we the only ones? Well, it turns out that other mammals enjoy a good laugh as well. On the left here, we see a rat enjoying a good tickle. And yes, scientists in our nation's top research labs have been tickling rats. I hope you're happy to know it. And it turns out rats love it. And rats laugh with high frequency squeaks. Now, they're too high for us to actually hear, but you can record them with a microphone. And when you analyze them, they look like exactly the same patterns of sound that we see in people that when we laugh, when we're tickled. Rats will even chase and play fight with the scientists' hands in order to get more tickles. And on the right, we see some orangutans who are clearly having the time of their life. Orangutans are an endangered great ape. They're found in Indonesia. That name actually means man of the forest, and they have very advanced cognitive and social abilities. And many great apes, orangutans, chimpanzees, apes, they all laugh when they're playing or even play fighting with each other. What really makes an orangutan laugh? Well, let's take a quick look at this one. And what we're going to see, if this works, is we're going to see a zookeeper play a little magic trick on an orangutan. Let's give this a go here. Let's wind it back to the beginning. So here's the orangutan hauling himself up. He looks inside a cup. And oh, look, there's a cherry inside of a cup. Well, that sounds yummy. Orangutans love cherries, and I do too. Now the zookeeper plays a little trick. Let's see what's in that cup now. Holy smokes. Oh my God, the cherry is gone. And it is the funniest thing this orangutan has ever seen. This orangutan cannot believe the trick that's just been played on it. It is hilarious. He's going to think about it a little bit more. Oh, still the funniest thing we've ever seen in our lives.
Crazy guy.
So, orangutans enjoy a good, oops, there we go. Once was, whoa. Sorry, something just paused on my computer. Let's bring that back to life. Why is that happening? Orangutans enjoy a good benign violation, just like a person. The orangutan laughs and we laugh too. So it's a pretty universal experience among mammals like this. So now let's go one step further, because we're talking here at BrainHQ. We're talking to people who enjoy thinking about brains and thinking about brain training. Why does the brain find something funny? Well, the brain finds something funny because it turns out that the brain is a prediction machine. The brain is constantly guessing what's going to happen next based on input from our senses and a lifetime of experience. For example, here's someone walking, and now they walk some more. And so our brain makes a prediction. Well, what's going to happen next? Well, probably they're going to keep on walking. It's not that exciting. That's what usually happens when we watch people walk. But oops, they slip on a banana peel. Now, I know it's a classic joke, but sometimes the old ones are the best ones. So now our brain is surprised. Our prediction failed, but it's benign. It's not too bad. And so it's comedy gold. And that's what makes the brain find something funny, that benign surprise. And in fact, that failure of prediction, your brain finds it funny when you guessed what's going to happen and you would have ignored it if it had happened, but instead something different happens. So scientists naturally wanted to study how humor works in the brain. Probably they were just exhausted from tickling rats and doing magic tricks from orangutans, and they wanted to work with people. So they turned to brain imaging experiments. So to start with, they needed some images that are funny and some matched images that aren't funny. The idea is to show both types of images and measure what parts of the brain are more active when we see something funny compared to when we see something that isn't funny. So here's an example of what they used in this experiment. You might even recognize this cartoon. It was pretty famous a number of years ago. It's called Bizarro. So here on the left is the funny one. This was the one that was actually published in the newspaper, back when newspapers had comics. We see this guy, he's stuck on a desert island, classic setup. And next to him, he's hallucinating, because I guess he's been on this desert island for a while, but it's his hallucination that says, if I have to spend one more day on this island, I'm going to start hallucinating. And it's actually the hallucination is hallucinating this guy stuck on the island. Well, that's kind of funny. It's surprising and incongruous. And so scientists then took that version and they made a non-funny version. They took out the hallucination, and now the guy is just on the island saying, if I have to spend one more day on this island, I'm going to start hallucinating. So that kind of makes sense, but I don't think we would say it's funny. So scientists showed both versions of this and many other cartoons like this, and they asked what parts of the brain are more active when it's funny compared to when we're just seeing a cartoon like this. And they found three main functional areas in the brain to be active when we find something funny. So here we're looking at a 3D picture of the brain. This part up here is kind of the front. We're kind of viewing it from the side. So this part is like outside of my forehead. Here's the top of the brain up on my head. And then you're kind of seeing the left hemisphere of the brain here. And that turns out it's the left hemisphere where most of the action is at when we find things that are funny. So there's one big brain network shown here in red called the temporo-occipital junction. And this is a part of the brain that connects early visual processing, where we're just sort of seeing shapes and colors and so forth, connects it to memory and association systems that give those shapes and colors meaning. And perhaps this is what's detecting the incongruence in the joke. It's figuring out, hey, these things don't normally go together. A second area of the brain that lights up is called the supplementary motor area, right here up here on the top of the head. And this is a part of the brain that's involved in planning movement. You often turn it on before you move or when you're thinking about moving, but don't move. And here, maybe what's happening is people are finding something funny. They're thinking about laughing. They may or may not actually laugh, but the brain's planning that movement action. And so this part turns on. And then finally here, deep in the center of the brain, we see this activation in what's called mesolimbic reward centers. So these are neuromodulatory systems that release things like dopamine, which makes us happy and tells us, hey, that was fun, let's do that some more. And serotonin, which you probably know is a neurochemical that's related in mood and also related to depression and the opposite of depression, which is happiness. So when we see something funny, these centers are also activated. And that's probably why we enjoy something funny. It's probably why it lifts our mood. And that's probably why we like to laugh. So that's all well and good. That's about how we find things funny in the brain. But how can we ourselves be funny or witty or the life of a party, or at the very least, let's try and be a fun person to talk to? What do we need our brains to do if we're going to be quick like this? Well, actually, the first thing is that we need our brains to be quick if we're going to be quick-witted. And so if we think about a brain and we think about these two ladies involved in this conversation, having fun with each other, when someone says something, that information actually comes from our ear into the side of our brain here, the auditory cortex. And the first thing that has to happen is that basic sound needs to be converted into language up here in these language centers in the brain. And after they're converted into language, they need to be sent to the front of the brain to be integrated with memory so that what's being said makes some sense to us. And once it's up here in the frontal cortex, it kind of rattles around for a while. We have to generate new ideas and think of what to say next. And once we've thought of something to say next, and maybe something funny, it has to get bounced back here to that supplementary motor area. So we convert that funny idea into a speech action. Our mouths and our vocal cords and our lungs all get coordinated to say something. And hey, maybe it was funny. And all this has to happen incredibly fast. It needs to happen before the conversation moves on. I think most of us have been in a situation where we thought of something just hilarious to say, 6 hours afterwards at home when we're going to sleep. So our brains need to be fast if we're going to be funny and quick-witted in conversation. The next thing is that our brains actually need to have pretty good memory as well, because references and callbacks and things like that, people like them. They make people laugh. And here's a great example of that. Some of you may have seen the movie Airplane when that came out in the 80s. And this is a classic comedy. If you're into that style, it starred Leslie Nielsen, who you may or may not know, but just a wonderful comedian from that era. And there's a lot of jokes in Airplane. I'm not going to try and tell them. You can watch the movie someday. It's very funny. But there's one in particular that involves memory. And so in the movie Airplane, the first thing that happens is that a taxi cab actually rushes up to the airport. Someone's in a hurry. And we've all been there. We can think about that. And there's a quick joke right off the bat, because it turns out it's not the passenger who's in a hurry. It's the driver who's in a hurry. The driver actually jumps out of the car and runs into the airport and leaves the passenger there. And that's good for a laugh right off the bat. It's incongruity and a benign violation, right? We're surprised to see it's the driver who's in a hurry, but it's not that big a deal. He runs off. We laugh. Then we watch the whole movie, and then 2 hours later, there's this great callback, because at the end of the movie, it actually takes us right back to that passenger, and he's still sitting in the cab all this time. And he looks at his watch and says he'll wait another 15 minutes to see if his driver comes back. Now, this is a joke that involves the brain function of memory. If you're going to get the joke, of course, have to remember once who this guy was and how you introduced him, how you met him first 2 hours ago, and you have to retain that memory in your brain to find this funny. And if you're going to be the kind of person who's going to be funny like this in conversation, well, you have to have great working memory so that you can plan and make a reference and then come back to it a minute or two later and make people laugh around how you bring it back into the story. So memory is really important for a good sense of humor. And then finally, the brain needs great executive function, the ability to generate related ideas and then pick the best. So let's say you're starting a joke, right? Or a friend of yours says something to you like, my friend told me to invest in a new airplane company, and you want to say something funny. Well, your brain has to generate a whole bunch of ideas really fast and come up with some, like maybe, I'm not sure if it'll take off. Well, that's good for maybe a grin. Or another alternative, sadly, it never got off the ground. That made me laugh a little bit. Or even, but I'd rather invest in boomerangs. They always get good returns. That might be the best one of the three. But all these represent your brain's executive function, planning and thinking about alternatives. Now, scientists have studied how a sense of humor can change over the lifespan and can change with injury as well. And the way they did that is that they developed little stories and they told them to people. So, for example, and this story goes like this. The neighborhood borrower, I guess this is a person who commonly borrows things, approached Mr. Smith at noon on Sunday and asked, "Hey, Smith, are you using your lawnmower this afternoon?" And Smith says, "Yes, I am." And then the neighborhood borrower answered. And then scientists gave people 4 options. The first one was meant to be the humorous one. Say, well, fine, then you won't be wanting your golf clubs. I'll just borrow them. I guess that's funny. You know, poor Smith is stuck at home mowing his lawn and this guy gets to go off and play golf. One option was kind of funny, but it didn't make sense for the joke. Oops, he says, and he steps on a rake and he barely misses his face. That's kind of a classic cartoon gag, but it's got nothing to do with this story. A third option was just a regular story ending. The borrower says, "Oh, well, can I borrow it when you're done?" Makes sense, but it's not very funny. And then finally, there was an option that was just nonsense. The birds are always eating my grass seed. So they gave 20 of these to people who had brain injury and younger people and older people. And what they found out is that if you have a brain injury to that frontal part of your brain that's generating these different ideas, you make a massive number of errors on this. You generally can't figure out which of these is supposed to be funny and which might be nonsense and so forth. And that shows us that that front part of the brain is involved in humor. But then even between younger and older people, there's a little bit of difference. And on the average, as people get older, they have a slightly harder time figuring out which one of these things is funny. Now, that's not true for everyone, obviously. There's lots of adults who've stayed very funny into their golden years, thinking of folks like Mel Brooks or Joan Rivers or Red Fox even. And there's lots of younger adults who aren't funny at all. I was at a comedy club down in LA a few months ago and saw a lot of very young people who weren't very funny. So every brain is different, but this does seem to happen over time. And it turns out that a sense of humor is actually probably related to overall brain health. Here, what we're looking at is brain scans from healthy people, as well as people who have 2 different kinds of dementia, Alzheimer's and frontotemporal dementia. The color here represents how healthy the brain is, how much energy it's using. And you can see it's red and green for healthy people. For people who have Alzheimer's disease, the more rear parts of the brain start to use less energy. And in particular here in the middle, the hippocampus, which is related to memory, starts to not consume as much energy. And that's why people who have Alzheimer's have memory problems. People who have frontotemporal dementia, a different kind of dementia, actually lose function in that front part of their brains where they might plan jokes. And these scientists interviewed the spouses and caregivers of these patients, and they often noticed changes in a sense of humor up to 9 years before their partner had been formally diagnosed with dementia. There are many quotes from this, but here's one woman saying about her husband that he used to be very witty, and humor now for him, it has to be more obvious. He only laughs if other people laugh. And that's led scientists to start to think, well, could we use humor and design measures like this that would help us detect if someone's on this path and maybe then do something about it? Because it turns out that if you can keep your sense of humor, you might be able to add years to your life. So scientists in Norway, which I'm going to show here just because I think Norway is inherently a funny looking country, wonderful country, but come on, look at that edge, just ridiculous. Scientists in Norway studied more than 53,000 people over 15 years to understand factors that contributed to their overall health, vitality, and longevity. And one very small aspect of the study was humor, using the sense of humor questionnaire. And people who scored higher on cognitive aspects of humor actually lived about 8 years longer than those who scored lower. So if you can keep your sense of humor, you can find the funny in what happens in life and maybe be a funny person on your own, you're more likely to live longer. And, you know, we've even heard that from our own BrainHQ users. We had this wonderful story I wanted to share from you with Lauren, who lives in El Paso, Texas. She gave us permission to share this. And she said, hey, I was considered a funny person when I was younger. I did notice that I had become less funny as she got older, but I figured there was just too much going on in life with my career, my family to make jokes. And then she said something really wonderful. Since I started training my brain with BrainHQ, though, the jokes I'm making are more clever. It's like there's enough time in my brain to figure out the amusing aspect of what's going on. So here she is. And of course, she's a perfect neuroscientist. She's recognized that by training her brain with BrainHQ, she's faster, probably has better memory, better executive function as a result. She's a sparkling wit, the life of the party. And that's what we, of course, want for everyone who's training their brain, who's joined us today is, hey, we want everyone to lead their best lives with a fast, sharp brain. So with that, I will stop my slides. I'm sure there are some questions coming in. There we go. And Karen, do we have you on the line?
Hello.
Hey, so that was my science background on humor in the brain. I'm curious to hear what you thought a little bit.
Oh, it was great.
Oh, that's very kind of you. I'll just reintroduce you a little bit more to make sure people hear about you. As we talked, you have a wonderful background to chat on this topic today. You've got a master's degree in applied linguistics, so you certainly know what you're talking about with language.
Oh gosh, I hope so.
And you told me you got your start teaching English as a second language. And if you can find the humor in teaching people English, that's amazing. And you run improv classes now for all kinds of people.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic. So that's my intro of you, but why don't you share a little bit about yourself with our audience today?
I mean, that is a really good summary. I am very interested in language and language play. And I studied applied linguistics, which is kind of the theory of how people learn languages. So I was teaching ESL on the side as I was doing my grad school work. And then I taught for many years in San Francisco, like to visiting young adults and taught English to them and had a lot of fun with that. Currently, I work as a copy editor in a couple different fields. Okay. And I do teach improv for a few local theaters. I am teaching online improv as I have been for the last 2 years, which is its own challenge. Hopefully I will be back on the stage performing soon. I'm with a local theater in Oakland called All Out Comedy Theater that is going to be opening a new stage. We got a lost our old space in 2020. Forget it. We didn't like it anyways.
That's
so we have a
right.
new theater. Yeah, we're building a new theater from the ground up, and I am looking forward to getting back on the stage.
Well, we're all looking to life coming back to a bit more normal, and seeing you on stage would be a big step in that direction. So, yeah. Hey, so tell me, what's your kind of funny? Everyone has a different sense of humor. What are the things that you typically find funny?
I like dry humor. I definitely, I have a friend whose humor is so dry, sometimes it's hard to know if he's being serious or not. And I find that hilarious. I especially also find it funny watching other people not know how to take it.
There's the social and the group aspects of humor, right? You and him get the joke and you're building a little social alliance.
Yeah. But I also love situations, and this is particularly in improv, the type of comedy that I like is when somebody is taking a very ridiculous situation very seriously. So I really like it when characters are feeling their feelings and having an authentic reaction. Maybe it is exaggerated, maybe it is much more intense an emotion than it needs to be for a low stakes situation or something like that. So I like having that difference of feeling very seriously about something that is perhaps a little silly.
Well, and again, I think that comes back to incongruity, right? Someone's being very serious, but you recognize it's a little silly, and that's incongruous.
Yeah.
So, hey, maybe say a few words about what improv is. Maybe we probably have people in the audience who have maybe only heard a little bit about this, or certainly a lot of people who haven't done it. What would you say that is? Why do people do it?
Well, improv is a lot of things. So I'll give a quick rundown on like what the types of improv are. So for most people, when they hear improv, you often think about improvised comedy. You might be familiar with the show Whose Line Is It Anyway? I grew up on it. And that is an example of what we would call short form. So those are short games that are challenging and they can be played competitively, because you can actually win some of them. So short form is often very rapid fire comedy, and it's kind of one and done. It's very quick. You're in and out, and then you move on to the next game. Long form is more like an improvised play. A long form improv can be 25 minutes. It can be an hour long scene and an entire story with characters, and you see a lot of character development. And long form improv doesn't necessarily have to be funny. I've seen long form that is horror, that is drama, that is musicals. So you can have much longer stories too, but all of those are you're making things up on the spot, and that's really what improv is. And I think some of the things that are really important behind it is that improv is really messy. You're going to see a lot more bad improv than good improv. That's just how it is. It doesn't always work. But everybody's really rooting for each other. It's a team sport as opposed to stand-up, which is a single player
Yep.
sport where you craft and you hone the perfect joke, the perfect timing, you workshop it again and again. In improv, you try something out, you throw it at the wall and see if it sticks. If it works, great, you got to laugh. If it doesn't, never mind. You do something
Move
else.
on.
Yeah.
Well, that again speaks to that speed and that executive function, right? You just
Exactly.
have to, you have to keep sailing along,
Mhm.
along. And so, okay, well, so how does that, you think, relate to being a funny person in general, or being spontaneous or creative in everyday situations? Do you think that improv can help with those kinds of things? Or is it, hey, I'm on the stage and that's when I feel that way and that's it?
It will 100% help you with the second half, with being spontaneous and creative. Something that you hear a lot in improv, kind of a common teaching, is dare to be dull.
Oh,
Or as I tell my students, don't try to be funny.
don't try
The
to be
audience can tell when you're trying to be funny and when you're telling jokes
Ah,
rather than when you're telling a story.
mhm.
So
And
there's a
so-
big difference.
So if it's going to be funny, it probably has to emerge a little bit authentically from the situation, rather than, hey, I'm going to tell you a joke now. Here's my setup and here's the punchline.
Exactly. You want to be really in the moment
Mhm.
and really listening. And as you said, very authentic, because you really don't want to be worrying about, is my idea the most funny, the most clever, the most interesting? That's going to slow you down. You don't have time for that.
Again, back to speed of processing
Mhm.
there, right? If you're just up there showboating, you're going to be too slow, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's try this, right? I'm a neuroscientist and you're someone who's funny, and that's the difference between us. But maybe you could give us a peek inside your own mind, right? So you're up there on an improv stage and someone has tossed you a line, whether it's, hey, think of 3 funny hats, or, hey, maybe you're halfway through doing some improv on horror or drama. Can you almost try to reflect as to what you feel like your mental processes are? You're sitting there waiting and ready almost, I suppose, or maybe you're in the moment because the whole thing's moving on, and then someone gives you that line and you have to react. What do you feel like happens in your own brain as that happens?
Yeah, so there's 2 different places where you might be in a scene. You will either be in it on the stage actively, or you will be on the side watching. So we'll talk about both of those. So if you are in the scene, you want to be listening.
Yes.
You want to be keeping eye contact with your partners. You really want to be connecting with them and focusing on, how can I make my partner look good? How can I add to what they need in the story? And so that goes back to this kind of mutual support where you're trying to focus on each other rather than yourself. And it's so much more satisfying that way. So you want to be very paying attention, listening, and responding to what they are giving you. And kind of working from that. You don't want to be always piling on new ideas. You want to be playing with what's already there.
Okay.
If you're on the side, you're not just waiting for a chance to come on stage. You're paying attention. You're thinking about, like, what does this scene need? What would heighten the story? What would press the joke a little bit further? So you need to be very, again, listening, but also very flexible, because the story might not need you. That's fine. Not everybody's going to be in the spotlight all the time. They might need somebody to help end the scene when it makes a good stopping point. So you might be there to, kind of run across the stage and cut the scene if needed to. So they both require a lot of paying attention and flexibility. And always thinking about how can I add to what's there? How can I make what's happening even better?
Yep. That makes a ton of sense. And I'm reminded in a way, we do a certain amount of work here at BrainHQ with professional athletes, people who are just absolutely at the top of their game. And, sometimes when I talk to someone like that, they'll say, like a soccer player, for example, right? They almost feel like time slows down, right? And they feel like they're looking ahead and they're seeing how the people are moving around them, and they're seeing what their own path might be, right? To kind of move through those people and score a goal. Do you feel like anything now, you're a professional like you, an improv or comedian? I mean, do you have that kind of experience at all of I would imagine, I'm not in improv. I would imagine if I were on a stage, someone were tossing me things, it would be helpful if my time slowed down and my brain was working fast enough to keep up. Do you have any of those kinds of internal feelings, or do you feel like, hey, you're just well trained and these ideas bubble up without you maybe even needing to work very hard for them to come up?
I will say a second of silence on the stage feels like 1,000 years. So you often have this impulse to fill the silence with sound, which you should not do. So as much as we are training to think on our feet and come up with ideas very quickly, we're also always reminding, and this is something I struggle with a lot in my own scene work, is to slow down, is to take a breath and take a moment to kind of process, and don't worry about filling the silence. It's okay to have moments of silence in a scene. You can do other things in those moments. So we also play around a lot with physicality and just kind of having fun that way, playing with invisible objects, you know, miming various actions. You can do a lot of play without speaking. So it does feel sometimes like the silences go on forever, but it is okay to have those.
Well, that's that time stretching out. If the time feels to you like it's slowing down in that way, that's probably because you have very fast brain processing going.
It's not fear. It's definitely my brain.
So, you of course mentioned that you teach improv to people, and I wonder, as you see someone growing at those kinds of skills, they become more creative, more spontaneous, even more funny. What do you see changing in them, if I can put it that way? And I ask because we're a brain plasticity company here, right, at Posit Science at BrainHQ. We're rewiring people's brains with brain training, and I wonder, as you see your students improve, or whether it's over the course of one day or several sessions, how do you, how much you sort of think about what is underneath the changes as someone becomes a better improv player? Maybe I'd put it that way.
Yeah, I would say it's so satisfying to teach and watch people kind of have their own aha moments and grow and start trying new things. And what I see a lot is that people just become a lot more fearless. And by that, I mean more comfortable looking silly.
Okay.
So I often, there's a lot of different types of games that I like. 3 Things was one of them. I like a lot of games that are chanting, that are singing games even.
Okay.
And you can't do those at the start. That you can't warm up with a song, but you can end with one. Absolutely, because people are more primed and they're more comfortable. So a lot of what I see is people kind of forming more bonds with each other, becoming like a little family where you can really take risks. So not only are they more willing to play characters who get in trouble and characters who lose, maybe characters that suffer a little bit, because the audience does like to watch you suffer, whether it's your character or you as a human.
Yeah,
they'll take either one. But I see people who are more willing to just try out new things, to trust that they're going to be taken care of, that they can make an idea and other people are going to make that idea even better. And so they're okay kind of doing something silly.
That makes sense. That as they learn, as their brain rewires, they're actually gaining confidence in that way to do more things. So so it's not just confidence to be in the spotlight. I mean, that is scary, first of all, and you do get more comfortable doing that, but just kind of confidence, putting yourself out there. Yep. Maybe just one more question from me, because then I see we have quite a few questions from our audience. So, of course, you teach people these skills for a living. You run classes, and like anything, and learning these kinds of skills takes time and effort. But forget about that for a minute, Karen. If you were going to give advice just sort of as a one-off to people in our audience about how they might improve their spontaneity and their quick-wittedness, or their ability to make other people have fun and laugh, what advice would you give people? Should everyone sign up for an improv class? Or are there other kinds of everyday things people can do to kind of sharpen their creativity and spontaneity in that way?
Yes, everybody should take an improv class.
I think it's great advice.
But there are lots of things, there are things that you can do at home. There's ways that you can stretch your brain, as what you're doing, because improv is a muscle that needs to be worked out. Yep. So you're not going to take a class and walk out and just be like, I'm perfect forever now. That's not how it works. So I would recommend, if people do want to take improv classes, that you look for descriptions that use the words like real life or even applied improv, because these are classes that are going to focus on practicing the skills rather than performing. So they're not going to train you to be performers. And this is a lot of the type of teaching that I do and that I enjoy, is that there is no pressure to perform. We're just playing these exercises like three things, or, you know, a little bit like a lot of different things. But we're just looking at those skills that we can use to practice active listening, being creative, being flexible, collaborating well, both in being a supportive collaborator and being a fearless collaborator yourself. So all of those skills are things that you can practice through these silly little theater games.
And that gives me one last lightning round question for you. Can anyone learn to be funny and creative like that? Or have you ever had people who've come to you in your classes and you're like, this person is never gonna, no one's ever gonna laugh at something that's said? Put another way, are funny people born or are they made through practice and learning experience?
I mean, I think I have to believe that anybody can do improv. You know, only if somebody were coming into the class in poor faith and choosing not to.
You can't count that.
Yeah, that wouldn't count. Absolutely. I think anybody can try. It's just about training yourself to be in the moment and be authentic. And the comedy comes from that.
Well, that's an answer, of course, we love here at Posit Science, because we believe people's brains are plastic. It can change throughout their life, and anyone who wants to work hard at rewiring their brain can do it. So I'm glad to hear that's true for humor as well. Maybe I'll have a bit of me. Hey, Margie, with that, I see we have quite a few questions coming in. Do you want to find some? And Karen and I will take a swing at them.
Absolutely. And just as a reminder to people, if you want to ask a question, just hover your cursor over the bottom of your screen and click the Q&A button and type it in there. There's a lot of great questions coming in already. So the first one is from Jan. Why do some people love puns and others hate puns and not find them funny at all?
I can take a swing at that, but Karen, I'll give that to you first. If you,
I mean, is there a scientific reason?
Who hates puns.
I love puns. I love bad puns so much. It was in my wedding vows that I love my husband for putting up with my bad puns. And we wrote our vows separately.
And he promised.
He put it in his too, that he loved my bad puns. I like a groan laugh. I think different people like different types of laughter.
Yeah. And, you know, as a brain scientist, I think the reason people have different humors is, you know, the experience and the learning that they've had over the years. I think some people have been in lived situations where a little bit of wordplay like that has made the group that they're in laugh. And, you know, eventually that becomes something funny for me too. Whereas if, hey, the humor that you've enjoyed as you were growing up or in your formative years was a different kind of humor, maybe it was slapstick, or maybe you just appreciated a classic, you know, set up and delivered joke, then, hey, a pun is going to be more unfamiliar. You're not going to find that funny. So, you know, I believe that many aspects of our behavior like this are because of the environments we've grown up and learned in. Those have rewired our brains that, you know, certain things are more fun than others. So if you want to like puns, there's hope for you, but you don't have to. You can probably still be very funny without a pun. Thanks, Margie.
Well, here's a question that I wonder about too. What about those recall situations that were initially not funny at all, but then when you think about them later, they're hilarious? Like, for example, this person says someone spills a bag of flour and cries, but later when they remember it, it's hilarious.
Well, I can take a swing at that first as well. Or Karen, if you have a thought, you can jump in.
Well, isn't there that time plus tragedy plus time equals comedy?
Exactly.
Like, it's not funny in the moment, but looking back, you can laugh at the situation. I think I often have times like that where I'm in the moment and I will say to myself, I will find this funny later.
You know, if you can say that out loud to yourself, you're very disciplined. I'm impressed. And, you know, I think one of the reasons is because, you know, how bad something is fades a little bit with time. You know, you're in the moment and you drop that bag of flour and you're like, oh, come on, I wanted to make cookies and now I have to go to the store, and the, you know, the unpleasantness is very on your mind. But as time goes on and, you know, fine, you went to the store and you made the cookies, you know, from that benign violation theory, it's still a violation, something surprising happened, but it's, hey, it's more benign as past goes on. And that's why we can look back and find it funnier. I'd also say that I think most psychologists would agree that if you can do that, if you can take a little bit of time to reframe the things that have happened to you, not as tragedies and not as disasters, but, you know, to laugh it off, right? That's a very mentally healthy approach that I think most people can take, because it kind of helps you move on from something bad that happened. And that's probably a skill that all of us can work on practicing a little bit, as, hey, let's find a little bit of humor, even if at the time something terrible happened.
I think there's something to be said too about if something keeps happening, it will become funny. And this is a technique that we use in improv, which is one, bringing back ideas from the beginning of the
Sure.
story,
Yep,
because
yep,
then
yep.
the audience thinks that you are a genius for remembering something. So you want to work your memory to bring that stuff back because it's very satisfying. Patterns are very satisfying for our brains.
Mhm.
So we think of ways that we can create a pattern in our story. Either if something got a laugh, we're like, how can we heighten that? How can we make that same situation happen again with a twist, and again and again and again, more and more ridiculous every time? And that can create a very satisfying laugh.
It becomes a running joke. That being said, if I drop a bag of flour every time and come into my kitchen, I'm going to get pretty annoyed. But you're right.
Yeah.
If I saw you do it over and over again, I would probably
It might be
find that
funny.
very funny step by step.
Mhm.
So, great question, Margie.
Okay, so this is a question from Gail. What's happening in your brain when you're laughing so hard you can't stop, you're crying, you're holding your belly, you can't breathe, that kind of laughing?
Yeah, that is a great question. And, the brain's a very finely tuned organ, and there's a very sort of subtle and fine line between it working well and it not working at all. So those kind of very like physiological aspects of laughter, right? Not necessarily the cognitive side of finding it funny, but that motor action of laughing, it's actually governed by systems in the bottom part of your brain called the brainstem, which actually relates to things like breathing and controlling your heart, these very automatic functions. And hey, that's great. I think everyone has enjoyed a really good, this is so funny, I can't stop laughing. But that being said, there are people who have certain kinds of degenerative brain disorders or brain damage to the brainstem. In particular, there's a neurological condition, I think it's called the pseudobulbar disorder. And, people actually can't stop laughing. They don't find it funny at all. It's actually quite a terrible situation. If you've ever had uncontrollable hiccups, you can imagine how bad it might be, even for just an hour, to find yourself that you can't stop laughing. It just isn't funny anymore. And so these things can actually, be neurological issues. Now, I don't think that's what the questioner was raising, but what I mean to say is that, your brain, you can get to a certain point, and then a little bit too far is your brain actually entering the dysfunction. And so what's happening to the questioner there is probably, those automatic processes, just like keeping you breathing and keeping your heart beating, are starting to take over. And that's what's making it uncontrollable laughter. For most of us, though, we can pull out after a little while.
Great. There's a couple questions here about kind of cultural differences in humor. So one says the Swiss have jokes and cartoons that other nationalities just can't get. So can you speak a little about why someone from one culture might find something funny that someone from another wouldn't?
And Karen, please tell us, which is the funniest country while you're answering this question.
Well, I will say, when I was teaching in San Francisco, I taught a lot of young adults from Switzerland, Swiss German specifically. I'm not sure why, just the agent that we had sending students over, and Korea. And that was a very interesting mix of two different teaching styles, two different school styles that the students were used to. So there was often a clash with expectations of what a class would be like. And so I think that there's something there too of just the culture that you're brought into, maybe a little bit different expectations of what humor is.
Yep. I think that's exactly right. And you can bring it back to that psychological theory of benign violations. We probably all have a roughly similar idea of what it is to be benign, but what it is to be a violation, what it is to break the rules, that's really different, let's say, in South Korea versus Germany versus America versus
Exactly.
Venezuela or something like that. And that can explain why something that is just hilarious here, is not at all funny in German and might even be offensive in South Korea. And it's because we all have that different set. That being said, I have to say, speaking of English as a second language, that the German's notoriously not funny. But every day when I get off the subway stop here in San Francisco, there's a big sign up from the Goethe Institute, which is a German cultural institute, and they're bragging about how hilarious Germans actually are and inviting everyone to come study German so we could just see how funny Germans actually are. Different cultures, I suppose, again, different rules, and what it means to break the rules, what it makes to be funny or not.
Right.
Well, I'm just going to read a joke that someone put in here. Because,
all right.
Yeah. I want to hear a joke.
Ready? What happens? This is from Nick, by the way. What happens when you boil a funny bone?
Lay it on me. Oh,
Be
Karen might
something
even
about-
have a punchline.
Now I'm like thinking about it. I was like, oh, boil a funny bone. You're making soup. You're making a broth. Where's the pun? I don't know.
Oh.
You get a laughing stock.
Oh, stop.
You're
That's
on the right
excellent.
I was
path.
there.
That is excellent. I'm getting my way towards 25 laughs a day. And thank you, Nick, for adding one really good one.
I thought it was good.
That was good.
The next question is from Jan, and she says, well, what about sarcasm?
Ooh, sarcasm. Well, Karen, is sarcasm a form of humor, would you say? This is a controversial topic, so you can express your personal opinion.
I think so. I mean, I think that it gets into the debate of irony versus sarcasm, of saying the thing that you don't mean when you mean something else, or saying the thing that you wouldn't expect when you expect something else, which is often kind of the difference between sarcasm and irony. I think sarcasm can often be very mean because you're saying the thing that you don't mean. And so if you say things like, oh, I'm going to be 20 minutes late. Great, super, wonderful. You're annoyed. There's no humor in that.
There's no good part of that.
Yeah, you're not trying to tell a joke. You're just trying to express how you feel, and you don't feel like using negative language.
But when do you see sarcasm as funny? When does it work as a form of humor?
I don't know. I don't know if it works in the same way that irony works, because irony is you're not expecting that.
Right. Irony is more like, hey, there's something incongruous here. There's something that, these two things you might have expected to line up don't line up. I'm in a camp, and lots of people don't agree with me, and that's completely fine. But I'm in the camp that I don't find sarcasm funny. There's almost no situation in which I think which I end up laughing at a sarcastic response. But I think, like you say, Karen, it really all does depend upon the intent. And, I think I can see the humor in it when I really get that it's coming from a good place, and maybe a person's trying to make me laugh with it. And maybe just so much of my own personal experience, the way my brain is wired, is that I have found that most people who are using sarcasm are coming from sort of a more bad place. They're more actually irritated or frustrated by their situation, which is why I find it hard to see as humor.
Yeah, I think that is often how we are expressing ourselves with sarcasm, is when we are expressing a negative emotion that we're having.
We're trying to express that frustration. So more puns and wordplay, please.
Yes.
We have a couple questions about neurotransmitters.
Uh-oh.
So one is a little less specific, says, would you please say a few more words about the role of neurotransmitters with respect to a sense of humor? And another is more specific, which is, I have Parkinson's disease. That means I have little dopamine. Does that affect my sense of humor?
Those are both great questions. They're probably coming from that brain imaging slide I showed, where we saw that, hey, when people see something funny compared to something that's not funny, one of the systems that's activated in the brain are these mesolimbic reward systems, which involve like dopamine. So dopamine, some people call that the pleasure chemical or the happiness chemical, but it's a really little bit different than that. What dopamine does as a neurotransmitter is it tells your brain, hey, whatever just happened, try and get that to happen again. Like, that was good and we like it. And that's why, if you eat a piece of chocolate, you'll get a piece of dopamine release. Your brain thinks, well, that was yummy. That's why often we have one bite of chocolate, then we have the whole bar, because we get that initial bit of dopamine. Our brain keeps going. And humor probably causes dopamine to be released in our brain because, hey, we enjoyed resolving the incongruity. That was interesting for our brain to figure out, hey, why did our prediction fail, and what can we learn from it? Let's do some more of that. So that's probably why that dopamine is being released. With regard to Parkinson's, of course, Parkinson's is a neurological condition that involves the loss of dopamine, but dopamine gets depleted from the brain in various different places at various different stages. So some people start to experiencing that dopamine loss, and that's what leads to the movement disorder that's so characteristic of Parkinson's. Some people, as a result of that, start to have issues, for example, making the facial musculature changes that are involved in laughing. And if you can't laugh, it's a little bit of a reflective system. It becomes a little bit harder to actually find things funny if you can't laugh. That being said, many people, experiencing some of those motor symptoms don't really experience any of the cognitive systems of losing dopamine, probably because of exactly where that dopamine is being lost. And so, hey, their sense of humor and all other kinds of things are going to be very intact. If a person's experiencing Parkinson's or the early parts of it, we'd make a lot of recommendations about how to evolve those dopamine systems, right? New learning is good because that drives dopamine, but on the basis of this, as many things as possible where despite a challenging condition, you can find the bright side and have a good laugh or see something funny, that's probably going to exercise those systems and might turn out to be helpful.
Great. Well, now I'm going to read a one-liner from Kimberly.
Oh, one-liner. All right.
You ready?
You bet.
I have the world's worst thesaurus. Not only is it awful, it's awful.
Mm.
That worked for me.
I like that.
Yeah, it's a nice little bit of wordplay.
That takes you a second. I like that one.
Yeah. It's 2:00, but I'm just going to, 2 people have asked this, so I'm just going to end with this question, which is, could we do more to incorporate humor into BrainHQ?
Well, you made me laugh, so that's a good start right there. That would be wonderful. And, in all seriousness, the earliest versions of the brain training program we ever built, some people have been with us that long, went back when it was CD-ROM and called the Brain Fitness Program. There were actually these animated brain coaches, and they were giving people encouragement and, telling little jokes and so forth. But what we ran into was the problem that was raised by an earlier questioner, which was it was quite challenging to make those funny for just about anyone doing brain training. Some people thought they were great and loved them, but we got a lot of feedback, and Margie, you were around for it. Like, hey, this is not making me laugh. It just seems kind of insulting and annoying. And, we wanted BrainHQ to be accessible and beneficial to everyone. And it was very, very hard to find the right sort of comic style that, what is funny to everyone? Well, almost nothing, I would say, Karen. I mean, are there any jokes that you would say are absolutely funny to everyone?
I don't think so. I think just going back to everything that we've been talking about the cultural differences in humor, is it really depends on your audience.
It's very, very challenging. So if people have some ideas, send them in. We always want more ways for BrainHQ to be engaging and fun, if not quite funny, perhaps. But it's a great question, and that's really what we ran into. So thank you.
All right, well, there's some other great questions, but it is 2:01, and I think we have a couple things to wrap up. So perhaps we should be done with questions.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have one or two more slides, right?
With 1 or 2 more slides, we're going to give some of Karen's information so that you know how to find her book and other information about her if you are interested in that. I think Stephanie's setting that up. There you go. It's Improv for Everybody is the book. Oh, sorry, no, that's your website.
That's my website.
And tell us about this book you wrote.
Yeah, so role-playing games, like D&D is probably the most common one that people know, is another big hobby of mine since high school. And from my first improv class, I knew that I could take all of these storytelling skills and apply them to my hobby, which is also, telling a story collaboratively. So all of those skills that I had talked about would apply. And at the time, 10 years ago, there were only a couple of books for gamers about improv, talking about what people had learned and applying the theories. There's lots of books about improv, and those are great. But there wasn't a lot really telling, like, well, what can I take from this and apply to my hobby? And there were really also none that would tell you how to do that. They all just said, well, take an improv class. Mm-hmm. So I started teaching a series of improv classes at conventions and in the Bay Area and at local stores, and even for private gaming groups that asked me to do these things. So I was teaching a class that was in the context of gaming for gamers. And so I was talking about specifically how can you apply this to your hobby, and in what aspects of gaming will these skills be useful. And so the book came out of that. We published it in 2018. The publisher is Evil Hat Productions, which is an RPG publisher.
Good name.
Yeah. I'm not sure where Evil Hat, I know I've heard the story, but I can't explain to you why the hat is evil now. But we put the book out in 2018. It did really well. It reached the end of its print run. And I said, I have so much more that I want to put in it. So we started making the second edition, which has about 50% more content. So it's all exercises. And it is, again, it's kind of by gamers, for gamers. It's in that context of here's how you can apply these skills. But it has all of these games. It has the rules for 3 things if you want to know how to play it.
All right.
And I have contributions from other people too, which is very exciting. So I have other exercises from people. We also had contributors write for advice on how to adapt the exercises that you're doing either for online play or for accessibility reasons. So there's just a lot more in there I'm very excited about. And it is funding right now on GameFound.
All
This is
right.
the first time that Evil Hat has used something than that other fundraising platform.
Yes, I've heard of that.
We're just not using that one now. So we really want this to do well. GameFound does a lot of board games, and this is kind of one of its first RPG adjacent things.
Mhm.
So we're hoping to make a big splash.
All right. Well, if the first edition was that successful, I imagine it's only going to grow with the second. So we will, Margie, I think we'll send these links around when we send our wrap-up email. And hey, if people want to join a class, they can look at improvforeverybody.com.
Mhm.
And if you play games, or if you have someone in your life who plays games, take a look at this book. I'm sure it's going to be very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to mention one more thing, which is stay tuned for our next webinar, which will be on May 25th. It will be a BrainHQ office hours, and the subject will be all about the personal trainer. So if you're interested in that, wait for a email on that topic, and you can join us then.
Sure.
Other than that, any last words, Henry?
Karen, thank you so much for joining. It's really been a delight to talk about this with you. I've learned a lot myself, both as a neuroscientist and as someone who enjoys something fun. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was really great.
All right. And to everyone in the audience, well, I will sign off and say happy brain training. Enjoy the rest of your day.